So after having done all these brewing guides and all these brewing theory guides, I thought I'd review one of the most popular brewing guides on YouTube. This is my reaction to the James Hoffmann V60 Ultimate Technique. So before we get into the video, if you guys are new here, my name is Vincent and I'm the head roaster for Tales Coffee. And if you love educational and experimental videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you can get the latest updates on my newest techniques. So a quick overview of his technique is that he uses 30 grams of coffee and 500 grams of water. The grinds are about a medium fine and he uses really hot water. So I think he said it's the hotter the better, especially for lighter roasts. Maybe darker roasts, you can go a little bit lower in temperature. But he first starts off by setting the paper, getting his grinds, setting it up. He does a little well, does a quick bloom, and then he moves on to this pour. Now this is where it kind of gets really interesting. He does a singular pour after the bloom, but it's in two parts because they serve two different purposes, and that is really cool to me. So let's actually watch this together and talk about each segment of his brew. So we'll be starting at 4 minutes and 5 seconds on his technique. And yeah, let's actually watch this together.
In the example today, I'm going to be brewing 30 grams to 500 grams, which is enough coffee for 2 people. I think it's a nice amount to share. Now, in terms of grind, I would recommend something that's on the slightly finer end of kind of medium. Now, it's really hard to communicate grind size in a video. I can share you some examples of the ideal grind size for a 30 to 500 ratio next to, say, some espresso grounds.
So he talks about how he likes to brew about 30 grams to 500 grams just because it's easy to share for about 2 people and it brews a decent cup size. And if the purpose is for brewing it for more than 1 person, I think it's actually great, so I really like that too. If it's for 1 person, you can just scale down the brew ratio yourself. You can use less water. He actually talks about that a little bit earlier, but yeah, you can just scale it down a little bit. As for the grind size, he talks about how he likes to use medium fine, and I love that. I think that actually has like the best kind of extraction rate. It is very hard to showcase grind size over a video, so he was just trying to explain that as well, but it is on the finer end of the medium, but not quite to the espresso.
Help remove any potential papery tastes, and it will also preheat the brewer.
So this is where he preheats the filter, preheats the dripper, and sets the filter. He says it gets rid of the papery flavor and it preheats, so it heats everything up. So I really agree with this. The only feedback I would have is that I don't think he set the filters extremely nicely. You can see that one side is leaning off after it. And so I encourage people to set it, to press it. I'm sure it's for the video, but if you want to set it in a little bit deeper, you just make sure your finger's in and then you hold it down when you pour the water, and this allows you to have the best proper filter set.
Add your grounds carefully to the center of the V60, and then once you've done that, create a little well in the middle of the grounds.
Right here, he's setting the grinds. He puts his grinds in there and then he uses his finger to kind of set the grinds. I really like this because the grinds have to catch the water in a certain way, and this allows the water to flow and extract the grinds much more evenly.
You want to make sure you're using your water as hot as possible, certainly with lighter roasts. If you're using a pretty dark roasted coffee, it's okay to wait 15, 20, 25 seconds after the water is boiled before starting to pour. But if you're brewing something very light, the hotter, the better.
Here he just talks about how he really likes to use really hot water. The hotter the better, especially for lighter roasts. For darker roasts, you can actually wait 15 to 20 seconds to kind of let it cool before you start the pour. So I actually agree with this. I think using a really hot water for lighter roasts is much better, just because you want to be able to extract a lot more flavors. The darker roasts, because a higher water temperature can actually cause like a scalding kind of flavor, I tend to drop really low personally for my darker roasts, but I'm guessing he would be in like the 92, 93 range. And I think that is fine too. It brings out a lot of flavors at that temperature.
Hey guys, it's December, it's finally the holiday season, and you're only watching this video for one reason. It's because you or your friend is a huge coffee snob. So why not get them specialty coffee from Tales Coffee? So right now we're running a special deal. If you use code SINGLEPOUR, you're gonna get 15% off, so Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah, whatever it is. Enjoy. Visit tailscoffee.com and use code SINGLEPOUR for 15% off.
Make sure your scale is zeroed, start your timer, and immediately start to pour. And we're going to gently pour 2 grams of water per gram of coffee. So here, about 60 grams of water. And we want to make sure that we're trying to get all of the coffee wet in that initial phase. If you've got a large pocket of still dry coffee, you can use more water, but I really wouldn't use more than 3-to-1 in the bloom phase. As soon as you've added your water, put the kettle down and grab your brewer and begin to swirl in a circular motion. Now, what we're trying to do here is make sure that all of the water and coffee are nice and evenly mixed together. Some people like to do this with a spoon and to stir it together, but
So this is what we call the blooming phase. He first starts off by saying that he uses a 2-to-1 ratio in terms of how much water to how much beans is in there. So in this video, he's using 30 grams of beans, so he'll be pouring 60 grams of water to saturate it. And after he saturates it, he does a swirl with his hands, and he lifts the cup up as well so that it can drain properly into there. I have personally kind of mixed feelings on this. He was saying how he doesn't like to use a spoon as much and he prefers the swirling. The swirling is hard to control, in my opinion, in terms of how much agitation and where you're agitating. Now, certain beans are, they're a little bit different in terms of how receptive it is to the water. And so when you swirl, you might cause a lot of gases and it just floats on top instead. And it doesn't have as much time to kind of dig deep and break through all the gases and all the dry clumps. Now, it's a very useful tool for actually creating a huge amount of agitation, but I think using a spoon allows us to get more even agitation, like personally speaking at least.
The sort of slurry as you swirl until you see it look nice and evenly mixed. If it looks lumpy, keep swirling. We're going to let it rest and bloom for up to 45 seconds. If you're in a cafe, you may only want to wait 30 as the returns do diminish a little bit beyond that, and I certainly wouldn't wait longer than 45 seconds.
So here he talks about the blooming and a little bit of a checkpoint thing. Now the checkpoint is that he always swirls until it seems like it's very nice and evenly kind of agitated, completely moist, and I think that's a great kind of way of judging it. I really agree with this. Now, going back to how he doesn't like the spoon, I think it's because spoons cause a lot of agitation, but not necessarily in always the right space. Whereas swirling, you can get this evenness that he's talking about, and it's a great way because it slowly agitates everything. For me though, I personally like to use a chopstick because then it kind of is like the best of both worlds. I get to agitate like a spoon by targeting a certain way or a certain place, but I don't actually get as much agitation as a spoon, and I get as much agitation as his swirl. So I have a better control over how it is agitating, and I can also get that nice, pasty, even agitation that he's looking for. So I would use a chopstick myself.
The theory is that we're allowing CO2 out of the grounds, making those grounds easier to extract in the remaining phase of our brew. And then we're gonna pour the rest of our water in kind of 2 phases, even though it's gonna be one pretty continuous pour. Here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get 60% of our total liquid in the next 30 seconds. So we're gonna aim to have 300 grams in total poured into the V60 by 1 minute and 15 seconds. This phase is actually really critical.
So this is where his technique is very interesting. He actually has one large pour coming up, but it's split into 2 sections. So he says we have to get to 60% of the brew by 1 minute and 15 seconds. So he's looking to get to 300 grams of water in total. So that's, I think somebody did the math earlier. It was about 8 milliliters per second. Pretty cool actually. And he says it's really critical. So let's actually watch and listen to why he says it's really critical.
Pour water into a V60, you disrupt that coffee bed, right? You churn it up a little bit. And it seems to me that in testing, there's a kind of ideal amount of churn. In situations where you don't disturb the bed at all, they produced very slow brews that didn't taste that good and would encourage you to grind coarser, which will mean you extract less.
After watching this, he's saying that in this first initial brewing part of his next pour, you're looking to actually pour with a little bit of a churning. So that's just a little bit more agitation. And as you notice, he starts in the middle and moves around in this like kind of quick motion, and it causes a lot of agitation. And you can see that there was one giant floating clump that came up that he pressed down afterwards with his motion. So this is an agitative pouring technique that looks to make sure everything is broken but fills up at the same time, if that makes sense.
Pour too aggressively and you create channels and pockets through which water seems to run very quickly, essentially under-extracting the coffee and making it taste bad.
So he's saying that if you pour too quickly though, you get under-extraction and a bit of channeling just because certain clumps have not broken up. And that's what I was saying. He just, as you can see, he's looking at the larger clumps. He pressed that down. Once you get those big clumps broken up, you don't actually get too much side channeling. It's just mostly that you're just looking to make sure to submerge all the darker grinds.
The dose that you're using. So once you've hit 60% of your total brew weight, you'll see your cone is pretty full. And that's a good thing. We want the cone to be full for most of the brew to maintain that thermal mass. Keeping the temperature high is actually really, really important.
So he talks about how using a higher water temperature or having the cone filled very high is important. It also goes with how he uses a higher water temperature. Using a higher water temperature allows you to have a higher flow rate, especially when the slurry is filled so high. So he's looking to have a faster kind of drawdown time towards the middle of this by having a full cone and having a hotter cone. Now having a hotter cone also increases flow rate, which could be very optimal in a brew like this.
What we're going to do now is pour a little slower and keep that cone topped up. We're going to aim to have 100% of our brew weight in the next 30 seconds.
And then afterwards, he looks to slow down the pour and reach the 100%, so that's the 500 grams. And that's just to kind of retain the height of the slurry, allows for that same flow rate. So I'm assuming he wants to aim for that same flow rate, which is nice and high, and it allows him to have quite a decently quick drawdown time given his technique and how large the size is.
Down and grab a spoon and give the V60 a little stir in one direction and then a little stir in the other direction. What we're doing here is trying to knock off any ground stuck to the side walls of the paper and not create a sort of swirling motion that lasts, because that'll create a dome in our ground coffee, which we don't want.
So he now takes a spoon and he stirs in one direction and then he stirs in the other direction. And the idea is to knock off all the grinds from the walls of the filter. So I do have some issues with this. I think the spoon is never really the best choice. It does actually cause a huge amount of agitation, especially when you're stirring in two different directions. The spoon is more like a paddle. You're just stopping the flow rate, and there's going to be a little bit of a crash between the flows. And that does help knock off the grinds from the walls, but I don't really see the purpose from it. If you pour properly anyways, you wouldn't have resolving grinds on the walls. When you pour, I think you should be looking to press all the larger chunks off the walls anyways. I do think stirring is good. Stirring in one direction is a great option because it has a dome, which is kind of weird because he literally just said he doesn't like the dome. There's no explanation behind it, but personally speaking, I come from a siphon background. If there's no dome, you lose marks. We do value the dome. The dome allows us, it shows that we had a great flow rate when we're stirring, and it shows that we had a great extraction towards the end without disturbing the movement of the coffee itself.
I want the V60 to drain just a little bit more until it feels safe to do so, and give it one final swirl. And that's really going to help keep the bed flat at the bottom at the end of the brew and give you the most even possible extraction. But now we're into the drawdown.
So here he talks about how he just waits a little bit because the water level is a little bit high sometimes. He waits till it's about, I would say like a 70% full dripper, and then he does a swirl once again, and the swirl allows him to have this final movement, and it forces the grinds to kind of sink and it becomes flat. So he's looking for a flat bed, which I also think is perfectly fine for V60s. I personally prefer the dome though. Now, having a flat bed does cause a bit of a concern to me. It's not really often thought much, but having a flat bed is when your grinds are done extracting, when your grinds are kind of settled all the way to the bottom, there's a lot of, I guess, restrictions in terms of how the flow can be through there. So if the water doesn't want to flow through there, it will look for an area that it can flow through even faster. And sometimes it's faster to flow through the paper. So this is where a lot of people, I think we can't really prove it, or we have a lot of misunderstandings, but a lot of side channeling, as we call it in coffee, comes from the water moving through between the paper filter and not actually passing through the grinds. And when you don't pass through the grinds, you don't actually have an extreme amount of extraction, so you're not gonna be pulling out coffee flavors. Now, that's not saying that when you do a swirl, the water doesn't move through the coffee. It's just, it might be a little bit easier for more water to move through the sides than if you were to use a different technique or if you weren't to swirl at all. And that's because the grinds have set and the movement is, the flow rate is very restricted. So I actually think that this is not necessarily the best choice. I would probably remove the swirl entirely from his technique and just leave it to the 2 spoons. That would be enough agitation already, yeah. So for the rest of the video, he just kind of sums up everything, and just watching the drawdown, there's not much more to the technique itself. I just wanted to leave a couple of afterthoughts. Personally, I have actually tested this technique out and I quite enjoyed it myself. Using his technique, I found the most success when I left the swirl out. I just didn't think it was necessary. I thought using a spoon for the 2 directions was all right at the end, but I definitely did not like the swirl. Let me know in the comments below though, what you want me to react to next, or who you want me to react to next, and catch you guys in the next one. Bye.